Today's objective is the summit of Stob Ghobhar at 3,566 feet or 1,087 metres. Stob Ghobhar means the Goat Peak. It's one of several mountains over 3,000 feet in the Black Mount area. Now, we're not far from Bridge of Orchy, and Rannochmoor is about, say, 6.5 kilometres northeast of here. Now, the starting point for this climb is close to the Victoria Bridge in Clashgower Estate, Argyll. And now I know there are plenty of people who feel that hill walking's a mad idea. You know, what's the point of struggling all the way to the summit only to turn round and come back down again? But today we're going to show you there's much more to it than that. We're going to come across features to do with natural vegetation, maybe a wee bit of history, land use, and perhaps evidence of mammal activity. But the main thing will be to take a look at the scenery of this Black Mount area. Now, according to the weather forecast, it is going to be sunny with occasional showers, maybe quite a bit of cloud. The summit looks clear at the moment, so I think we better start. We're only a few minutes into the walk, but I would like to take this opportunity to introduce a bit of history. From about the 14th century down to about the 1850s, Scotland had a complex network of drove roads. And along these drove roads, cattle would be driven south to cattle markets or trysts, to places such as Crieff and Falkirk. And English cattle buyers would come up south to attend such trysts. Now, today many of these drove roads can still be made out, they can still be determined, but quite a few are now used as walkways or as routes for mountain bikes. Now, at the present time we're standing here on the old Glencoe Road, which you can see is an old drove road. And today this is now part of the West Highland Way. Now, this is a very busy spot indeed at the weekends because you get hill climbers and people walking the West Highland Way, battling it out for boot space. But a nice, easy, low-level walk is not for us. We're heading for the high and scary places. And to do that, we're going to head off in this direction here, following a right-of-way which is signposted to Loch Etive by Glenkinglas. Well, we've been walking along this well-constructed Landover track for a wee while out in the open and following this river, which according to the map is called the Avane Shira. But I'd like to get you to look at this landscape here. Now, to some this landscape may look wild and natural. Well, I mean, it's certainly wild compared to, say, townscape or farmscape, but it's not particularly wild. It bears a few imprints of man's interference. I'm referring to the solitary Scots pine trees that you can see there. That's all that remains of a forest that was once much more extensive and was called the Great Wood of Caledon, or the Caledonian Pine Forest. But over the centuries it was gradually cut down for timber, for fuel I suppose, to make clearings for cultivation, and latterly to make way for sheep grazing. Now, the area that you see was, as I said, much more extensively covered by this Caledonian pine forest, and there are still remnants of it in different parts of the Scottish Highlands. For example, there is a fair amount of naturally occurring Scots pine in Glenafric, also in Rothiemurchus Estate on Speyside, and on the right hand side of the road travelling north from the northern tip of Loch Lomond up to Crean Larich, you can still see a few Scots pine trees along the right hand side of the road in the lower part of the hillside. Rather stunted, I must admit, but they are there, they're hanging on in there. Now, Scots pine trees find it very difficult to regenerate in situations like this where the ground is open. As you can see, there's a great deal of grass, various grasses and heather and bilberry and so on. And when the Scots pine seeds fall onto that ground, then they find it very difficult to compete for light. Now, in times gone by, when the forest was much more extensive, lightning would cause forest fires, and the seeds would then be able to germinate on the burnt, exposed soil. But what is much more extensive are the man-made forest plantings, and I would like you to have a look at these now. Forest plantations are in the main composed of foreign introductions like Sitka spruce from Canada. Some hill walkers consider that planting uniform rows of Sitka spruce in geometrical shapes is a kind of vandalism on the landscape. In recent years, however, the Forestry Commission have tended to make the plantation boundaries irregular and more natural looking. Let me in, I'm in need of rest and shelter. After all, it's been a long walk in. Nobody at home. Apparently this, at least according to one authority, this is the old Clashgower schoolhouse. So they say anyway. But one thing is certain, this hut, or bothy, belongs to Glasgow University Mountaineering Club. Now, if inside it's like any bothy I've ever been in, it'll be littered with empty whisky bottles and gin bottles. No, I'm only kidding, sorry, I'm only kidding. I'm sure it's all nice and neat and tidy inside. But anyway, we're not going to be allowed in to find out, are we? I object to being denied access to a bothy. But anyway, the important thing for us here, this hut is a sign that we should leave the well-structured Land Rover track and turn right, or turn north rather, into a glen, following a stalker's path, which runs along beside a river called the Alt Toic, which apparently in Gaelic means the river of passion. So, let's go. All over the Scottish Highlands, in fact in the Central Lowlands too, wherever there are drainage ditches or tracks cut through the moorland, you often find these old tree stumps. There are many, many, many of them. They're all over the place. And this seems to provide evidence of a very extensive forest cover in the past. But we're not talking about the ancient wood of Caledon that we mentioned earlier. We're talking about something even earlier than that. If you can imagine this landscape just after the Ice Age, when the ice had actually vacated this area, say about 8,000 years before the present, the land would look really desolate. It would be covered in meltwater sands and gravels and boulder clay, and there would be a network of meltwater streams all over the place. Now, vegetation would gradually start to colonise this landscape. It would be simple plants like mosses and lichens, or as some people say, lichens. But those plants would be pioneering plants. They would simply be paving the way for more advanced vegetation, such as grasses and heather and bilberry or blaeberry. And those plants too, in turn, would simply be paving the way for more advanced plants yet. And by that I mean trees, forest cover. So the forest cover, which would eventually establish itself here, would be called climax vegetation. And what we'd have is that near streams, alder trees would establish themselves. On the low ground, but perhaps away from the streams to some extent, would be oak and hazel woodland. And then maybe further up the slope you would get birchwood. and higher up still perhaps mountain ash or rowan. Now this mixed deciduous forest would reach its peak, say about 6,000 years before the present, and then there would be changes would take place. The climate would begin to get cooler and wetter, and this forest cover would go into decline, and that decline would be well underway about 5,000 years ago. And this is the evidence that such a forest existed. Now, it's a bit strange, I suppose. I'm often puzzled about these roots all over the place, but there is another mystery that we can have a look at. Why should a woodland plant be found growing outside its expected habitat? Wood anemone is wind pollinated and will take hold outside wooded areas, providing there is some shelter. This glen provides that shelter. One curious phenomenon is that although the wood anemone is surviving out in the open, it still behaves as though it was growing in a woodland habitat. Well, it's been a very gentle incline so far, and I think it's about time we began to gain some altitude and do some serious uphill slogging. So at this point we leave the Stalker's Path, which as you see carries on the way up there, and we go down into this stream here to cross the stream, hop across a few boulders, scramble up the other side, and then head up towards the waterfall that you see there, and then on up into a corrie. So that's the next stage in this climb. What an idyllic spot to stop and have a well-deserved rest for this lovely waterfall here, sampling the nice crystal clear water. It's just dawned on me, there could possibly be a dead sheep up there. But we mountain men are tough, we don't care about things like that. Actually, I often wonder about the water that you find bottled in supermarkets. You know, that clear crystal mountain water stuff. There's an awful lot of sheep droppings out there. Anyway, it's quite a good spot to look over and review the track that we have just come, and perhaps name some of the mountains beyond. Just visible in the distance is Loch Tulla. The walk began at Victoria Bridge just to the east of this loch. Clearly visible running across the bottom of the picture is the Stalker's Path, which led from the Clash Gower bothy. Just beyond the road, linking Tyndrum with Rannochmoor, and close to Bridge of Orchy, lie a string of mountains popular with hill walkers. To the right, and just visible through the cloud, is Ben Ower. To the left of that is Ben Doran, and to the left of that again, with the flattish summit, is Ben and Doa. Oh dear. Now, people often say when they're climbing the hills they never ever see any wildlife. I must say I've seen quite a bit. You know, I've seen ptarmigan up on the summits. I've seen red deer, wild goats with big massive horns, jenny longlegs, a lot. Now, I did promise that I would show you some signs of mammal activity, because it is true, it is quite difficult to see wildlife. So you've got to really look for the evidence. And here we have this little hole in the grass. This is actually a field vole run, And a field vole is a small mouse-like animal. In an area like this, there could be anything up to 1,000 of them per acre when they've reached plague proportions. The populations fluctuate quite widely, and apparently they reach these plague proportions about every 4 years or so. And when the numbers do go up to that high level, then all sorts of predators come in, like well, foxes or weasels or stoats. But I think the main predator is the short-eared owl. Now, apparently the predators don't really have much effect on these population numbers. The numbers begin to drop before the predators have much effect, and some research shows that the numbers actually drop because the food supply runs out. But there's been still other research, this is rather curious, to show that the numbers actually begin to drop before the food supply runs out. Very curious indeed. Well, we've arrived at the top of the waterfall and are about to enter this enormous big amphitheatre feature. Now, what created this landform, I hear you ask? In fact, this is a corrie, and it's a glacial feature, and it was formed at the beginning of the Ice Age, when it would be initially just a small hollow in the hillside, and then with year after year of snow piling up into this small hollow, the snow at the bottom would become compacted and it would turn into granular ice called firn, F-I-R-N, or névé, and I'm not going to spell that. But this eventually would become glacial ice filling this small initial hollow, and then it would begin to slide downhill under the influence of gravity by a sort of rotational action, and the hollow would be enlarged by a process of glacial erosion. Now, the process of glacial erosion includes glacial plucking and glacial scouring. But what exactly is glacial plucking and glacial scouring? Well, I'm not going to tell you. Find out for yourself. Read a book. After all, this is supposed to be student-centred learning. But this feature has all the classic characteristics of a corrie. It has the steep corrie back wall, steep sides, a fairly flattish, or well, in this case, a hummocky floor, and quite often there's a small loch-in in the floor of the corrie, but there isn't in this particular case. And the other feature is where we're standing is the lip or the threshold of the corrie. So there you have it, a typical corrie. Now, the name of this corrie, incidentally, is Corrie na Muich, which means the corrie of the pig or the corrie of the sow. But I think in Gaelic it's more properly pronounced as Curra nan Muich. So there you are, a typical glacial feature. Now, the next part of the walk involves going into the corrie some way, then turning right and going up onto that ridge. The weather for today's climb has been fairly benign. However, in winter it can be entirely a different matter. Well, we finally made the ridge on the north side of the Corrie nan Muich, and according to the map we're now onto a ridge which is called the Annach Igach, but it's not the more famous Annach Igach of Glencoe, so there's no need to panic. This is a much more rounded, benign Annach Igach, although I must say that it does get a bit narrower further up. Apparently Annach Igach means the notched mountain, And if you put the definite article in front of that, the Anach, apparently in Gaelic it should be pronounced something like Anternach Éicach, the notched mountain. Now in Gaelic there appears to be several names for mountains depending on their shape. A rounded mountain is very often called Mial something or other. A more pointed mountain is sometimes called Stob something or Sgwr something. And any mountain that has a ridge, especially a fairly narrow ridge, very often has the name Anach or Eunach associated with it. If the ridge is more rounded, sometimes the name Drum is associated with it. So quite a variety of names. But there is an interesting feature here. Behind me is a Munro, Stob Ghobhar, Munro being a mountain in Scotland over 3,000 feet. But over here, says I, tripping as I go, there is the famous Ranach Moor. Now Ranach Moor has quite a bit of interest for glaciologists, because Ranach Moor at one time, at the height of the Ice Age, served as a reservoir of ice, a reservoir of glaciers. And one glacier would spill out towards the northwest to carve out the present-day Glencoe. Another lobe of ice would spill out to carve out Glenorchy. Yet another one would spill out to carve out Strathfillan. So this is why Ranach Moor is really quite famous as regards glaciology, apart from, of course, for its scenic value too. Now, what we have to do now is to move on up this nice, fairly rounded ridge until we come to the narrow section, the one that I suppose really justifies the name, Anternach Éicach. Well, here we are at this narrow little ridge, the narrow bit of the Anach Éicach. Doesn't seem too bad, but there's a wee bit of a wind just now and it could be rather awkward. So if you see me teetering a wee bit, you know, it's okay, don't panic, I'll be okay, I think. Anyway, here goes. Summit of the mighty Stob Ghobhar at 3,566 feet or 1,087 metres. I think it's time we really had our just desserts now and get some rewards for all that effort. And by that I mean taking in this fantastic scenery, the Blackmount area and beyond. We have some mountains to the west of Stob Ghobhar with stirring names like Ben Starav, the Bold Mountain, and Stob Ghobhar, the peak of the Corrie of the Scotsman. The plateau-like summit with the precipitous slope on its right side is Britain's highest mountain, Ben Nevis, at 4,406 feet. The most generally accepted meaning of the name is Hill or Mountain of Venom. The pointed summit to the right is also over 4,000 feet, and that's Carn Mor Gerach, the Big Red Hill. Not far to the north lies Glen Coe, and guarding the entrance to the glen is the magnificent Buchel Etive Mor. Here we have the rather complex summits of Argyll's highest mountain, Bidian Nam Bian. The normal route to the summit is from Glen Coe. Stob Ghobhar's nearest neighbour is Mial Avure. Just below the summit is the location of ski tows and chairlifts, part of the White Corries skiing development in Glen Coe. During the climb we have been on private land, Clashgower Estate in fact. In Scotland there has been a long tradition of freedom to roam in wild territory, and this was emphasised after the First World War, when men, having faced the horrors of war and being unemployed, were in no mood to be ordered off private estates and hill country. There is a law of trespass in Scotland, but it is contained within the civil law and not the criminal law. This means that, should you be ordered off private land, you have not committed an offence providing you leave peaceably. If you keep returning, then you could be charged with causing a nuisance, a difficult charge to make stick. The trouble often arises when land in Scotland is bought by people who are ignorant of this Scottish tradition of tolerance. Unfortunately, there is a new law of aggravated trespass which applies to all of the UK. It's aimed mainly at hunt saboteurs and travelling people, but this has never really been a problem in Scotland. Landowners who do not wish hill walkers or ramblers on their land could perhaps simply claim that by being there, they are disrupting estate management. The Landowners Federation in Scotland say that the new law will not be applied in this way, and that hill walkers have nothing to fear. Let's hope not.
Well, I think really all that remains for us now is to get down off Stob Ghobhar. There's various routes off, and one way is possibly to go beyond the cairn here and go down by another ridge called Stob Ghobhar, which will, no, sorry, that's not the right pronunciation, Stob Ghobhar, and that will take us down onto the uphill Stalker's Path, which we then just follow down to the Clashgower Schoolhouse, then back along the right of way to the Forest Lodge, and then back to the car.